name is Joan Sakaba, and I'm a member of the Formation Missional Team, which was tasked with setting up this event. And we'd like to welcome you to this evening session called The Next Generation. I want to thank Jeff for his time. I want to let you all know that he is not in Hawaii. He is in Seattle. That means he's working a couple hours ahead of us. So it's late night for him. And I hear it's very, very cold there and he's trying to get used to it. So thank you very much, Jeff, for joining us. Jeffrey Miguel Acido was born in the Philippines and grew up in Kalihi most of his life. Growing up in a working class neighborhood taught him to value relationships and community. For the last 5 years, he has worked in a community health center and developed programs that address the mental health and well-being of young men and boys. He created a civic engagement and community education program rooted in a popular education and liberation theology. He earned a master's degree in theology from the Pacific School of Religion and a PhD in education from the University of Hawaii at Mānoa. In this presentation, we will explore several youth programs that have been inspired by liberation theology, popular education, and indigenous survivance. Jeffrey will share his experiences in working with youth and intergenerational groups in Hawaii and California. He will share his insights into what worked and what didn't work when it comes to engaging with youth and creating intergenerational space. The workshop hopes to generate a critical dialogue of what it means to mobilize and inspire youth to assume leadership in church and faith life, as well as civic engagement. The presentation hopes to provide space to generate ideas and to dialogue about what it means to foster the next generation of faith leaders. He is most passionate about developing young leaders of faith to address social justice and practice a liberation faith. He wants to see a new cohort of young leaders of faith tackle the most pressing issues of Hawaii. So thank you, Jeff, and I'll turn it over to you.
Nice. Thank you, Auntie Joan. Thank you, everybody, for tuning in on your evening. I know you could be watching something else. There's great shows on Netflix and Amazon Prime, and so thank you for joining in. I'm gonna share just a little bit today in the same spirit that our guest speaker yesterday, Professor Ron Heifetz, in terms of his own experiences on in his own work on what works and what doesn't. So I'm hoping to share to more talk stories, share about sort of my own experiences of working here in Hawaii and working in California and now in Seattle, but mostly in the in the space of working in among youth, and in both in the nonprofit sector, in education, and in the church. And so I'll share with you some slides. Feel free to chat at any time, any of your questions. Um, um, and then we'll read it out loud. And so, I'm hoping that I can get you sort of the presentation. And I think maybe what's more important is the dialogue with each other, some of the questions going back and forth, because I think uh, um, talking story together might generate more wisdom. And so I'll share my screen now. I will watch maybe one or two videos. There's some old videos with some audio problems, but that's on my side, not on yours. Okay, so I'll share this now. So thank you, everybody. I added growing the next generation. Um, and the title, because I really have been for the last 10 years, maybe even 12, last 12 years of sort of my life have been involved in going back and forth between Hawaii and the continent, particularly the Bay Area and the Seattle area, and some stints in the East Coast as well, in terms of being with other practitioners and being with other people who are really concerned but more passionate about bringing out the gifts of young people. And so it's just sort of stories for today, and I hope I can sort of share stories of experiences of my own sort of journey. But maybe before that, I wanted to sort of introduce first that I'm going to read a prayer that's done by Dorothy Soweli, and for I've heard that seminaries don't study Dorothy Soweli anymore. I think maybe they think she's passe, but she happens to be a super auntie, what we call in Kalihi, who's these aunties with great superpowers and just loves community. But I see her as a sort of super auntie, concerned about the world. And she read a prayer in 1968. So maybe before I start my presentation, I'd love to sort of share with you the credo that she wrote, sort of as an opening prayer for us, if you will, just to be transparent at my own theological and political view. So we'll begin with Dorothy Soweli, and then we'll end with another auntie. Sometimes she's a favorite, sometimes she's not. Auntie Haunani K. Truss, Professor of Hawaiian Studies. Okay, so just to be up front, and then you get to decide halfway through where, well, how do I see Jesus and how do I see the church and what is the faith for me? But let me just read it real quick. It's the credo, and it's found in one of her books. She puts a caption. It says, below is a confession of faith that's shared at one of the October events in 1968 in Germany, which roused to no small amount of critique, including at least one charge of heresy. I have no doubt that many in our pews would sit uneasy if this were read out loud in our churches. But whatever we make of it, it's certainly a theological statement and a political one, as I believe all education is political and theological. So here it is. I believe in God who created the world not ready-made, like a thing that must forever stay what it is, who does not govern according to eternal laws that have perpetual validity, nor according to natural orders of poor and rich, of experts and ignoramuses, people who dominate and people subjected. I believe in God who desires the counter-argument of the living and the alteration of every condition through our work and through our politics. I believe in Jesus Christ, who was right when he, as an individual who can't do anything, just like us, worked to alter every condition and came to grief in so doing. Looking to him, I discern how our intelligence is crippled, our imagination suffocates, and our exertion is in vain because we do not live as he did. Every day I am afraid that he died for nothing, because he is buried in our churches, because we have betrayed his revolution in our obedience to and fear of the authorities. I believe in Jesus Christ, who is resurrected into our life so that we shall be free from prejudice and presumptuousness, from fear and hate, and push his revolution onward and toward his reign. I believe in the Spirit who came into the world with Jesus, in the communion of all peoples, and our responsibility for what will become of our earth, a valley of tears, hunger, and violence, or the city of God. I believe in the just peace that can be created for the possibilities of a meaningful life for all humankind in the future of this world of God. Amen. Thank you for allowing me to share with you a theologian that has guided me throughout my life. And I really very much appreciate Dorothy Soweli. Um, and believe it or not, my time at PSR, nobody introduced me to Dorothy Soweli except Professor Dr. Fumitaka Matsuoka's wife, Sharon. And this wasn't taught in seminary at all. And so after seminary is when I got to read about her, and it really sort of changed my life. So that's a little bit of my teachers. And normally in workshops that I do, I ask other people. We go in a circle, we hold hands, and we invoke probably the more important ritual that we do is our name, inviting of our name and our home and an ancestor. If we did that with 40 something people, it would cost us the whole evening. And so I do invite you to think about, what does your name mean, and where is home for you, where it's rooted in, and then an ancestor that has sort of guided you today, that maybe sort of guided you to the faith. So I invite you to sort of hold them in this circle today. because very much a part of me and a part of the work that I do is sort of invokes all three: name, home, and ancestor. And so I want to share with you who I am today, because very much, again, a part of the work stems from sort of my own experiences of growing up. And so on the left side of the screen, if we're sharing the screen, we have Lay's here. I'm that little kid. I was 6 years old with the Lay. The night before that, I was in the Philippines, waiting for my flight to come to Honolulu and join my mother. She went 2 years went ahead of us, as we were waiting for our visas through the petitioning process to become a resident of the state of Hawaii and then become a citizen of the United States later on. But this is sort of as a result. I'm a 1.5 generation Filipino in Hawaii, or Filipino American. These are sort of represent three generations of migrations on the left side. That's my mom in the vintage bomber glasses. All of my vintage friends would sort of salivate at what she's wearing now. She didn't know she was setting a trend among the millennials. Anyway, and so that's my sister that she's holding her hand. I thought I had just taken a flight from one city to the next city in the Philippines. I didn't know I was in another country the next day. But I grew up here in Kalihi. So that's the point five. They said if you're born somewhere and then you're educated in another place, you're sort of 1.5. But I grew up working class. So my mother, them, and you see in the middle of the picture, that's my in-laws and my family, my mom and dad next to me on my right. Um, and my daughter Waya, who's holding is being held by my mother-in-law, and this is a farm in the Wailua area that my family are all farmers, and so they got a chance to that. And then on the right side, you might be sort of wondering, sort of my own home church now. At the Pro City Church, and I got a chance to take them about 2 summers ago to Ho'olu'aina in the back of Kalihi Valley. It's certainly a jewel of Kalihi. If you ever read Mark Twain's travel logs, Mark Twain writes about Kalihi Valley specifically and how beautiful it was when he stayed there. And so this is as back in the valley as you can go. A place called Ho'olu'aina, a 100-acre nature preserve managed by Kokua Kalihi Valley. And so we do health center, we do kind of health visits. The dream is for that place to be part birthing center where our community can give birth in that place. But sort of this is who is me, grounded in sort of that immigrant experience, that farming experience, has done sort of church church work, both in my own sort of community, but in the last 5 years, particularly in the Micronesian community, is my work has been. And so sort of doing popular work. I wanted to share with you some of the experiences that I've been. For some of you, you might recognize some of the youth here. This is a while back. This is about 10 years back in the middle. But starting from the left side of the screen, like sort of mentioned before in my work in the clinic, it's a eclectic community health center, as you folks know who's had experience with community health centers. It's a weird space to be in. It's sort of both medical. There's a little bit of sort of churchy activity that happens. It's less medical, more community. But certainly part of the community health center, we have a bike program that I'm going to share with you later on. It's called K-Vibe, Kalihi Valley Instructional Bike Exchange. But this particular group, you can see my little 6-month-old baby. I think she's in there. And this is among young men and boys mental health and well-being program. It was funded by the Movember Foundation. If you folks have heard of No Shave November, they're the largest donors of prostate cancer research among men and boys, because that's the silent killer, or maybe not so silent killer in terms of cancer for men and boys. And so it's an Australian group that sort of funded us. They raised something like $650 million in 20 years just by using their mustache as their creative license for fundraising. The middle part is a more spiritual theological group. It's a program that I was a part of during my time in the Pacific School of Religion. It's called Represent to Witness, R2W. This was funded by the Lilly Foundation through PSR, that gave us a little over $1 million. And the K-Vibe one, they gave us about a $1.5 million to run a youth group. But the middle one is a youth group specifically trained, designed to train young people to go into ministry. At least that was the hope. And so we flew people all over, from Seattle, from New York, from Texas, from Hawaii, particularly the Big Island and Oahu, and more towards the UCC. Somehow we had a UCC connection, although there were some Buddhists in there and some Methodists and disciples as well too. So it was sort of a multi-denominational youth program. And so we flew them to Berkeley at PSR, and they stayed for about close to about 14 days. We housed them and we flew them in, and we went all over the Bay Area, teaching them what it meant to serve community, to be in community, to understand community through your own faith. And so a lot of it was specifically an API group, an Asian Pacific Islander group. But as the program got more popular, it became more Latino and more African American students started to came in. And so you just sort of see a whole diverse group of people. The picture is in the Pride San Francisco. So if you've ever been in Pride San Francisco, there's, the 2 million people converge in that one space. And so for some of them who grew up in a very much conservative churches, they told us not to tell their parents that they're attending the Pride event. I said, no worries. We won't tell them. We'll just say that we had Bible study in San Francisco. And a nice coffee. And on the right side now, I'm sort of part of groups of young organizers all over the nation, from the East Coast to Houston, Texas, to Oakland, California, and then to Hawaii. It's sort of young people aged from 14 to about 30 years old that come together to share tactics and to share strategies on how to create a healthier community. We had several workshops so far that, talked about community gardens, talk about using stories to create social change in the community. We had, how to create policy that can serve all of the community and not just a single few. And so these are some of the example of the spaces that I've been in, sort of very diverse, very young, very well funded. I have to say, I've been lucky enough. I mean, who has $1 million to fund youth programs these days, right? But you had some really radical philanthropists that really funded us. So altogether, all these programs cost maybe closer to about $4 to $5 million. In terms of their budget. Sort of just the community examples that I've had, K-Vibe, they would do sort of Kalihi Ahupua rides in which, being a seminarian fresh from seminary in 2009, I imagine doing a Stations of the Cross. For some of you folks maybe who's familiar with Stations of the Cross. I grew up Catholic most of my life. And so I would do the rosaries and I would go to church and I would see all of these, 13 or 14 stations, maybe even 12. I sort of forgot how many pillars, but it sort of follows the life or the passions of Jesus in the gospel of sort of what happened. Some stories are made up and some stories, are made up even more. But the lessons are really awesome. And so instead of how did we use that to bring together community in Kalihi, I had this sort of idea of how do we bring out people to care for the community. And often when I put out calls, because I'm sort of an academic, work in the university, and sort of part of lefty circles, And so every time I put up an event, I get activists and I get students. And so, less than 5% of the world has a bachelor's degree, right? That's the top 5%. Less than 1% of the world has a PhD. I can't have only the 5% of the world come to these events. And so we did Stations of the Cross as a kind of an experiment. And you know what? We had close to about 300 non-activists, non-academics, which is like the mom and pop, the dad, the business owners, people all over. And we walk, guess what? We walk for 8 hours around Kalihi. In this day where it's so hard to get 1 hour out of people's lives, I was so crazy during that time. I was going to do foot washing. So we picked 14 sacred sites in Kalihi that we asked them to share your own personal story and then share the story of the land. So, all that storytelling 14 times we stop, right? And it takes about 20 minutes. I mean, it was insane. And we said, wow, it worked. And this was on zero monies, right? People just sort of brought in. And I just thought, wow, there is something here. People are craving community. People are craving prayer. But I said, let's take prayer outside of the church, or at least a church building. What does it look like to look outside? And so you had all these strollers. We had several strollers as aunties and uncles calling for water. All their family came. It was so awesome. And then it became the motto of our annual fundraiser for Kalihi Ahupo, a ride. The young people like biking, and so we took the same concept, picked 5 sacred sites in the Ahupua'a, and we told the stories of the place, both the people and then one of the story of the land. HBD shut down the roads, so again we took over all of the uh, uh, roads from Mauka to Makai. So we rode up on Kalihi Valley and then all the way down to Sand Island, and we had close about 200 to 300 people riding on their bikes at that time. It was so awesome. Anyway, so that's one kind of example um, of some of the events. We have Ali Consciousness in Hawaii that started in Pearl City Church, and it's probably the best iteration of an intergenerational group that I've ever had. You have as old as a 16-year-old and as young as a 60-year-old. And so sort of we traveled together. We brought some of the young folks together and some of the elders, and we went to Angel Island in San Francisco. You got to know the history of Chinese American history, Asian American history, and sort of what's happening right now, so we get to know themselves and their own communities. And so these are just a list of things that we've done. Young organizers, that's that once a month workshops that we come together with, and sharing ancestral stories, connecting leaders to leaders, gaining skills to address health equity, building. For whatever reason, the young people are very much into building community garden these days. Yeah, it has to do with the number one issue, maybe for millennials, they said, is climate change is the number one issue. And so they love building community gardens from California to New York to here. And so I wanted to share you just some clips of what we do. So this is a very old video, and we took about 15 to 22 youths all over the island. I mean, all over the Bay Area from across the nation. And so I'll play some of the videos so you get to see some of the youth in action, but also just part of the methodology. Very quick, with 2-minute video and then another 3-minute video.
This is how critical faith starts. We go right into the context. So the first place we go to is City of Refuge, United Church of Christ in San Francisco. City of Refuge is a trip because it's working class African American, lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer church in the middle of the city. This summer we were invited to be part of the homily on Youth Sunday.
My name is Victor McKinney. I come from South Central Los Angeles.
All right.
And we come here with something that has a critical faith.
That's right, critical faith.
So it's not just all the sunshine. Because a lot of people like to equate their faith, with just, like your brother was saying earlier, it's just praise and all that kind of stuff, but it's not the real connection with God. Having a connection with God, you know your struggle. You know that He's with you through it all.
It made me unlearn my socialization in the world. It really allowed me to dig deeper into my roots, knowing your own story, and through that, lifting it up. Your power. Where's your power? We've been pushed down. We've been oppressed. We're still in it, but it's about walking humbly and loving God and doing real justice and being justice in the world.
That little clip was just as a testimony for the methodology that we use. This is a whole 7-part, 30-minute film, but I'm only sort of picking different parts. And so, one of the things that I love about sort of doing that, it centers on your own story in the same way that Professor Ron Heifetz talked about, that stories is really the same thing that you do in the exam room is the same thing sometimes that you do outside in terms of eliciting stories as both medicine, diagnosing symptoms, all of that. And then you go into the body, right? When it talked about that. Well, for us, it's sort of stories, and then we go into the community. How's your story connected to the larger community? And so we bought the same youth on that Youth Sunday and another week, and we went around Chinatown and the Sunnydale projects in San Francisco. And so the audio will be a little bit off, okay? I sort of apologize. We didn't have technology back then.
Necessarily have to have a degree to have knowledge. You can get knowledge from the streets, learn from the atmosphere, and especially through experience.
I grew up in the Fillmore and I went to Ben Franklin Middle School. There was a real disconnect between the Asian population and the Black population. I couldn't relate to them. I thought, like, I live in the Fillmore, I'm from the hood, life is hard over there, you can't understand me. And then just, seeing how they live over here today, going to the SROs, I didn't even know what that is before today. But just seeing that, and it was just a trip to me that their rooms are, their whole house, basically, their apartment is like smaller than my bathroom. So, it was just crazy.
In Chinatown, I was able to see oppression more clearly because the people that lived in the SROs were being oppressed by the higher class, trying to take over their buildings and or kick them all out basically, and make a parking lot out of their homes.
These houses are really, they have asbestos, they have lead, there's lead in our water.
What we're also fighting for is environmental justice here.
Going to the community calls, seeing all those houses boarded up, the way the kids live, that's not a life that a young kid should be growing up in. It made me think about our community. Be a strong leader and help my community become stronger, become one instead of fighting each other.
Nice. So that was one of our methodologies, research and study. And we visited Sunnydale projects. I think Tupi was talking about, he was, you know, he's Tongan black, and he always thought that Asian Americans were rich, that the Chinese were rich, that the Japanese were rich, until we went to Chinatown and visited the SROs. And as if you've ever seen an SRO in Chinatown, San Francisco, there's 4 people living in one room, right? And particularly elders are wasn't treated very nicely. And so at that time, we were part of a campaign of creating more affordable housing for our elders. But these are young 17-year-old, 18-year-old, 19-year-olds being sort of exposed to what's normally in their backyard. But if you just sort of walk through life, you would never know. And it was that space in which we worked in. And so a lot of the times it was sort of our stories, understanding where we come from, how we're connected, what's happening in our community. Sometimes it's the best visual aid. We don't need no fancy technology. You just sort of walk around the neighborhood, but you need a particular lens to see your community. And if you've been using sort of a tired, rehashed narrative of young people, get them off the street kind programs, well, if your programs is just basic to get them off the street, that programs will reify the stories about young people, that they don't belong in the street, that they're troublemakers, that they're all of these things. And so if you think about sort of programs in our own community, think about how already from the framework of bringing in young people is already horrible. They already see young kids as bad. Well, if you think about kids as bad, your program is probably going to spit out the image that you projected in the very first place. And so these sort of programs, R2W, really centered the wisdom of the youth. You know, the youth know so much. They probably know all of the secrets of the church, you know, because they hear everything and they know everything, and they never say anything unless you sort of ask them, right? And even if you ask them, there's a certain way of asking them. And so we said, you know, at that point, this was about 10 years ago, and when I came back onto the continent, I said, a lot of the young people were leaving the church when we did that program in R2W, because the response of the pastors were, when the kids came in and they says, oh, pastor, we want to do Bible study, but can we do it this way? Or pastor, we want to start our own churches. Can we do it this way? And almost always the response from the pastors were, nope, no, no, no. And so why would you want to start a church? We have a church here. Why do you want to start Bible study? We already have Bible study. Instead of just letting the church, the young people say, go get creative. We'll support you in every which way. After that, they sort of left the church. And so not everybody, but at least the people that sort of we work with was so craving for that space of support. And so when I came back from Berkeley to come down to Hawaii, I started to develop, like, what are some of the best things that I learned from that experience? And that methodology, that popular education methodology, again, rooted in liberation theology, rooted in Latin America, where your story came first. Your story was the center, was so, to me, amazing and life transforming. It didn't make Jesus the center of our faith. It made maybe the way that he lived, maybe it made the way that you live the center of your own faith in relation to their own faith. And so their faith was maybe framework. I love sort of this Buddhist saying. They said, if you see Buddha on the road to enlightenment, kill Buddha, right? You can't necessarily say that about Jesus, right? If you see Jesus on the road to heaven, you kill Jesus. I mean, it's not really like that. But I sort of took that philosophy, like what happens if you see your story as also a gospel for today? What happens if there was a gospel? I mean, you have Francis in my screen. What if there was a gospel of Francis? You know, what if your story informed the context? And if you wanted to transform your context, you had to understand your story. And when you understood your story, you can transform the context in which you live in. That's the world that you live in. And so I want to share with you today, sort of this November, it's the bike ride that I've been a part of in the last several years. I'm still sort of really part of them, trying to nurture. Particularly when I took over the program, it was mostly Filipino. So I grew up Filipino, right? So it was mostly Filipino. And I said, there's something wrong here, because this program is taking only the creme de la creme of our communities. It's akin to Punahou and Iolani and Kamehameha, recruiting from poor neighborhoods of the very best, right? When you do that, you create some kind of, if Punahou wanted my daughter to go to their school, I would very gladly, having said that, there's something awful though when we do that, when we take the best of the best from that particular community and alienate them, because they have to go back home, right? So I have one friend who was recruited as an all-star quarterback from Iolani, and he would change his uniform, change his clothes right before he get on Iolani campus, and then when he get back home, he would change back his clothes. And I said, why you do that? He says, I don't like getting bullied. KPT, he used to live in KPT, Kohio Park Terrace, which is the largest public housing project in the state of Hawaii. And he used to say, I get bullied. Like they think I'm a sellout, that I'm not part of them, or that I'm haole now because you go to Iolani. And that was so bad. He says, we wanted to sort of honor that place. How do you do that? How do you take care of the 95% of the working class and the youth, right? How do you do that? And so we created kind of a whole methodology, but I let the video sort of speak for itself. It centers around a young Filipino and a Korean man, Josh and Randall. But it sort of tells their story of why spaces like this that I'm going to talk about, mentorship, is really important. It's centered on young men and boys, but the shop also welcomes all genders and sexual orientations. Yeah. So we'll watch it a little bit.
When I was little, all I knew was to work when I was little. It's been survival to keep our family together and fed. All I thought was to be a man, you had to be strong, you had to be macho, no fear. There wasn't much guidance. My parents were never home, so that's how I actually found myself into K-Vibe.
These are palalas in here. 1, 2, 3.
We're here in Kalihi Valley, deep in the heart of Honolulu, probably the last working class district in urban Honolulu. Kalihi Valley means the edge. It's tough, it's gritty, hardworking, but a lot of respect, a lot of love for this place. And so largely made up of Native Hawaiian, Filipino, Pacific Islanders, now a great influx of our Micronesian sisters and brothers.
Kalihi is very unexpected. Kalihi has a lot of surprises. And there's a nonprofit bike organization down in Kalihi called K-Vibe, which is really unexpected.
Beautiful, beautiful, beautiful.
So K-Vibe is a bike shop. You put 12 hours of sweat equity, you get a bike, but you get something more.
When I heard that you could put in 12 hours and walk out with a custom bike, I was like, this is like amazing. I did it for a free bike, but I wanted to feel like I belonged somewhere.
I was about 12 years old when I first came to K-Vibe. K-Vibe was eventually like a place where I hung out, like set a foundation for me of how I want to live my life.
Yeah, a lot of the kuyas, a lot of the ates, a lot of the older brothers, older sisters, their father, their mothers, their communities working 2 or 3 jobs. And so who's at home? Having that mentor makes all the difference.
We teach them how to fix bikes, how to maintain bikes, and also our cultural circles, where we speak about our social biographies and have a place to express their feelings.
Sons and daughters of
When we in this space, we trying to practice what?
Active listening. Before doing the circle, they're ashamed of who they are. They want to say their English name. They don't want to say their Chuki's name. They don't want to say their Filipino name. They're afraid when you ask them where there's home, we'll say Hawaii. They won't say from the projects. They won't say from the Philippines or from Micronesia. And so can you imagine a whole community who was colonized, who was displaced, who was immigrant, so they come to K-Vibe in this circle and they say, well, no, my name. And I bring this ancestor. And to remember them, that's subversive, that's radical, that's the education that we're having here at K-Vibe.
We just want to be our best version of ourselves so we can show the community, show the world who we are and that we exist. And we smiling, and we hopeful, and we bright, and we beautiful, and we brown, right? Young Kings, you guys do this every day.
K-Vibe has evolved because of the resources and the help from Movember Foundation. We have at least 7 full-time mentors in the shop running programs. Young kids fixing bikes, but also doing art, music, doing poetry, attending sort of college classes, being invited into public health spaces to tell their stories. We only reached 2 public housings here in Kalihi. We have about 4 or 5 more that we need to reach out to. There's a lot of work to be done in Kalihi and in Hawaii in general.
And so that's what we try to do at K-Vibe. We're just changing the narrative of Kalihi, of brown boys. Instead of people saying that they're dumb, they're gangsters, they're dangerous, they're really like loving, caring. It's just, it inspires me.
I think about my 12-year-old self, the kids who don't have mentors. K-Vibe is not just a bike shop, but a place of healing for men.
We got all these beautiful bikes and all these spokes, and every single wheel of liberation that you build will get us closer to hopes and spokes.
That circle, to me, is the great equalizer that we have here. They can summon sort of their experiences and they can share their story together. Kalihi is what they have, and so they have to protect it. They have to cherish it. They have to honor it.
Now repeat after me. I am the greatest version of myself. I am a warrior of my people. I am an extension of my ancestors. And today, I stand tall. Today, I stand tall. For my people. Best version of us. For my brother. For my brother.
Cool, yeah. It always gives me tears when I get to see young men and boys and girls say, yeah, this is my home. This is my name. And today I bring with me all these ancestors, that I'm not an accident of birth, that I was intentional in my life, that I have a gift, and that I have purpose and kuleana. You know, I don't get that in school. I've been going to school all my life. I've been graduating all my life. And it's in these spaces that I feel like I'm closer to God, you know, I'm closer to community. And I don't know, maybe that's what Jesus meant when 2 or 3 are gathered. Christ becomes present. And so, you know, these are just some of the elements, you know, some of the stuff that you see, the mentorship, just the key elements of a transformative and young adult youth leadership program. These are, you know, take what you can, leave the rest. But these are sort of what I found out to be really meaningful. Mentorship, and particularly intergenerational and contemporary mentorship. So you have to have one person maybe around your contemporary that's good at what they do, but you have to have an intergenerational one, because we need the elders to share their stories. You know, that's the real hard part, yeah? Because it's hard to share stories. You know, so hard, we gotta pay, we got to go therapy. We pay somebody else to hear our stories because it's so difficult and makes you so vulnerable. But how you do that with somebody who's younger, or older sometimes. And so just to get them in the same space, to me, has made all of like, I've been mentored by uh, awesome people. I've got to travel with, can you imagine this name? Maybe some of you know this, Fritz Seifert, Professor Fritz, right? And then his students was David Panisnik and David Wong, all these crazies from Honolulu Community College. I mean, and they took me halfway across the world, paid for all of my flights for 3 months. I got to travel with them as a young, I'm gonna speak pidgin now. Okay, can. As a young Kalihi boy who only knew Kalihi and the Philippines at 6 years old, to be taken halfway across the world and stay in 5-star hotels and eat different foods, to go to Muslim China and visit the largest mosque in Asia, in China, and to see a blonde hair, blue-eyed Chinese. That I was like blown away. I was blown away. And so that mentorship, I got to be mentored by another super auntie, Amy Agbayani, who helped build Operation Mānoa. I mean, for her, and I saw her on the side of the road carrying groceries to deliver to World War II veterans and elders. I was like, and then she said, "Here, come carry the bag. We go feed today." Okay. I mean, it was that like mentorship, that's so important. You have to teach them what you know, because you have a little bit of that roadmap. And then the popular education piece, that one to me, I think probably is the one greatest thing I learned in seminary. That sort of popular education, that way of learning, by the way, that has its roots in the Gospels and in union organizing. It's sort of people coming together with no expert, right? And then talking about what do they need, what they can do, right? And then sort of generating that power from within. And then and only then, if we need a lawyer like Uncle Clay, then we can invite him in. But he's not invited unless he's asked, because oftentimes the experts are the degreed people, right? We keep asking them. You look in the news, who they interview, all these professor of what and professor of this. And so, but we never get to be invited in our own communities. If you're from Ka'u in the Big Island, you're an expert of Ka'u. If you're from Pro City, you're an expert of Pro City. Why do we have to invite other people talking about other communities as experts, right? I'm certainly not against experts, although that should be an equal seat on the table, right? So that's popular education rooted. Travel. The big part of what I learned over the last 10 years is you gotta take Hawaii students, Hawaii youth outside of their own context. I get some kids who never ventured out of Kalihi. Like some of those young boys, we took them to Japan. And all these Micronesian boys that we had in Kalihi and KPT, you know what they realized? They're part Japanese. And that wouldn't have been, right? Because World War II, Micronesia, all of that stuff. And they all, look at our Micronesian community, they all get Japanese last names, right? But they scared to claim that part of their history. They scared to come out to talk because the stigma. And so travel allows them to see contradictions and also affirmations of who they are, right? Meeting people, eating different foods. If you only eat Spam, you never know how good other foods are, right? And some of our kids only eat Spam and Vienna sausage, right? Research and study, like going out, researching the community again. What we say community crawl, think about a baby crawling on all fours in the community. You see the nitty gritty, right? You see not the bird's eye view, maybe the snail's eye view, right? That's really important for us. Know the roots, right? Know from the bottom, know what it means, right? Critical faith. And then we come back and then we have reflection. What do you see? Not, let me tell you what you see now, but what you really saw. And let's really talk about it. I teach ethnic studies in the university, right? And as we know, ethnic studies is mostly a lefty kind of space, left of center. And so our conservative students are so scared to talk because they don't like be judged, right? And I say, it's okay. So even that space is restrictive. And then I'm in sort of real conservative churches that I've been part of, but the young kids are, maybe have lefty orientation a little bit, and they're scared to talk in church. So there's like two youths that are not talking to each other only in context, but if you create a context in which people can experience a common experience like travel and be safe in that space, I bet you they're gonna talk to each other. And certainly the programs that I've been part of are more left leaning. But when we imported this to Hawaii and the K vibe, these guys are coming from conservative and liberal churches as well too. And then, when you get their stories animated, they tell their parents, and then you may or may not have more donations on Sunday. Okay, it depends of what was the reaction. But the reaction of the young people. So, the K vibe students that I shared, the direct action in their communities, the Mayor Caldwell at that time was going to repave the roads on Camp 4 it was a mega highway, it was 4 lanes. And it was killing our community. We would pass by and elders would just get struck all the time, fatalities all the time. And so we kept petitioning the mayor's office, and they didn't do anything. And so you know what the kids did? 16-year-old, because they knew their story, because they did the popular education and they did the research study, they ended up petitioning to change and to reline the roads to a 1 left turn, and then 1 way going up, 1 way going down, but a left turn for bicycle and a bike road. Well, the mayor's office refused for a long time. The young kids called the press conference. A 16-year-old's calling for press. The mayor's office, I think at that time, got hold of it, and then he said, okay, let's change. Let's follow your idea. I said, okay, it's your idea, Mayor. You can take credit for that. That's cool too. Anyway, we got it, and now it's sort of young people change and save so many people's lives just by relining the roadway. Of course, it increased 30 minutes of traffic because we only get 2 lanes now, but nobody's complaining in terms of the youth's advocacy. And this was the young people doing that. And so, they got a bite from policy change, and then they ended up helping to pass, that community college law that we had several years ago, that you can go to school in community college. They were a big part of that policy and that resources. So their change went from themselves of being proud of who they are, their ancestry, and then they cared for their home. And then it went out of caring for the state of Hawaii. Now every single person who wants to go to community college can go essentially for free, provided that we apply for FAFSA, and the state will cover the difference. So I don't know if the governor fund is funding that right now, but certainly in the last couple of years that was true. And so these are some of the elements that I have, and I hope that we can sort of start to build all of that stuff. Okay. What was the result? Well, now they have sort of guided social support. They affirm their own knowledge and ways of knowing. They can speak their language without a teacher in the DOE scolding them. We've had so many reports like that with our young folks. Expanding their critical perspective. If you're coming from conservative churches or more liberal churches, right, you get to sort of be more expansive. How does that person sitting next to me think and see the world? And what can I learn from that person? And as a result, you have an expansive social network, both from the elder social network and in your contemporary and the young people. So, folks from, let's say, Church of the Crossroads reaching their hands to UCC Filipino. Again, I don't know the politics, okay? I'm just saying all those names. But that's the hope, that they start to sort of reach their hands across. Clarity of gifts. This is a big one. I've been teaching at the University of Hawaii for a long time. Often my students, the most lost ones, are ashamed of who they are. Right? They don't know their gifts, they don't know their purpose, and they don't know their kuleana. After some of these programs, I began to see some of the young folks like really understand, what are my gifts? Can I sing? Can I dance? Can I facilitate discussions? Can I build? Am I an organizer? It begins to sort of come up, and then their purpose, and then responsibility. that comes up. So that gift, asking your youth, what is your gift? You know, and what purpose and what kuleana, what community can you apply that gifts for? And then they become leaders in their own communities. That's what I'm super proud of. There's several folks who came out of these programs are now sort of legislative representatives in the state of Hawaii. So I can say that for sure. Some of them, they went into law. They went into the more mainstream. Some of them are lawyers now. Some of them are doctors. A lot of them are social workers. I don't know why. Maybe this program, we need to build a school of social work at UH because we're sending so many students there. But they want to be social workers. And to me, social workers are just maybe pastors in the community without theology, but they certainly play a key role towards each other. So all of these things, right? That's been sort of the results. I want to end with this. I started with with Auntie Dorothy Soeli, and then I'll end with Auntie Haunani K. Trask in, I think, 1982. I just find her words so powerful today in terms of leadership, in terms of rotation of leadership, in terms of doing the work when the camera is off. Like, this is a nice Auntie Haunani. Later on, if you like the yelling Auntie Haunani, I can send that video to you, okay? But this one is a nice one. You can go to bed with this one, okay?
I'm sorry that I couldn't stay until 5 o'clock when I was do a wrap up for everybody. But I'd like to just share my mana'o now. It's a good stopping place in the program. When I came into the Ohana, we had just lost Brother Ohana meetings. Were very small because we had lost our leadership. George and Kimo were gone, and Walter and Richard had been in jail. And at that time, it looked as if we were fragmented and we didn't have anything to organize around. The year and a half of occupations had taken a tremendous toll on the Ohana. People went to jail. They paid for their aloha for the island. And once we lost our leadership, coupled with that psychological toll, everything seemed to come to a standstill. And yet, I learned from the people who kept on working, who kept on striving, that at that time, when movements are down, when people are down, that is the time that the true Ohana principle comes out. That's the time that you really have to work hard because nobody's there, the cameras aren't there, the press isn't there, the public is looking at you and saying, wow, those guys don't know what they're doing. And it was only 1 year later, it was only in 1979, after working very hard, putting the statewide Ohana back together again, that we went back into court and we got legal access. And legal access cannot be overemphasized, I don't think, because that means all the people of Hawaii who want to go to Kaho'olawe can go there. That's what it means. It means that we can touch that aina. That's what George and Kimo paid for with their lives. We also got, a year after that, National Historic Site status. And what that means is that we did something the state legislature could not do, the Congress would not do, our elected officials would not do. We, the grassroots people, worked for those victories with no help from the outside, especially no help from the state of Hawaii. And there's a lesson there, there's a lesson for all of us. And that lesson is, don't rely on other people. That's what Judy said earlier. If you see the dishes, go wash them. Politically speaking, what that means is, if you get out there and work, even though it looks really bad, you will make headway. My own political analysis is that the Ohana has been the most successful political struggle between 1970 and 1980. We have had the most victories of all the other struggles put together, and that's because we've lasted the longest. The Ohana got started in 1976. This is 1982. Look at our victories. National Historic Site status. The Navy's cleaned up at least 1/3 of the island. They surveyed the historic sites. But more importantly, we entered the public consciousness. We said to the people of Hawaii, Kaho'olawe is important, and it's important for cultural reasons. That's something Pua was saying on Wednesday up at the university. Kaho'olawe is important because it belongs to the Hawaiian people. It's an example of the way we want to exist with our environment. That's why we have been so successful, because we say something that finds meaning for all the rest of the people of Hawaii. We are an alternative to Waikiki. We are an alternative to Kavakio. We are an alternative to what happened in Ka'anapali. We present the alternative, but it looks very hard when you look up from the bottom. It looks like it's impossible. And yet, here we are 4 years later with all of these victories. The Ohana is also an example of what I would call the rotation of membership. Leadership in the Ohana carries on, it continues. When I came into the Ohana, Pua wasn't in it. When I moved out of the Ohana to do some work up at the university, Pua came in. That's how you do it. You rotate your leaders, especially the young ones, especially the people who are now teenagers. In 5 years, they're going to be the next people carrying on because they have the energy. And we're in the background telling them, this is our experience. This is where we came from. This is how we got where we are now. Leadership is very important, and you have to continue it. You have to respect it, and you have to continue it. If the Ohana had stopped after we lost Brother George and Brother Kimo, it would have been a terrible sacrifice for nothing, but we didn't stop. And that's the message. You don't stop, you keep going. You keep going until they stop the bombing completely. That's what we're really here to remember. To remember two people who really gave their lives to say something very important. Aloha Aina is important to the extent that we will give our lives. In 5 years or less, we will be on that island doing this concert because we will be in control of it. Thank you.
Awesome, yeah. It sort of reminds me of that sort of rotation of leadership and how many young people are in the committees at our church. I almost have to smile and laugh at times. I'm 35 years old, and Auntie Jean will say, "Oh, be careful. Everybody gonna like you in all the committees because we all see each other all the time." And then we say a big laugh, and there's a little bit of tear that sort of falls down because there's a craving and an understanding that we cannot do this anymore. We need more energy, but more than energy, we need fresh ideas so that the church, so that we allow the church to be relevant in society, and we free Jesus from the cross so that Jesus can walk with us doing our work out in the community. I grew up Catholic, so I always saw Jesus inside the church. Now I went to the Methodist church, and now I stay in the UCC. I say, oh, Jesus must stay here. Jesus must be outside of the church, right? So it's like I get really excited when I see like people out, doing, like I see there's a lot of great things that can be led intergenerationally. And as we know, young people played a key role in a lot of movements, civil rights movement, women's rights, queer rights movements, the march in the resistance in South Africa, the rebellion of the Soweto people, right? This was led by young people saying, we're not going to speak Afrikaner. We're going to speak our own indigenous languages. It was young people. So ethnic studies, if you look at that, young people saying, we want to learn our own history. And we're not going to wait for the university to teach it. We're just going to go. For some of you are the old ethnic studies OGs. I appreciate you folks. Right? Maybe some of you folks live 1955, Democratic Revolution in Hawaii. Japanese Americans through the GI Bill used it and said, you know what? We're going to flip the state. We're going to make it work for our community because we're tired of being, house boy and house girls? You folks taught me that. My elders taught me that. That was what a Japanese American occupation. You graduate from UCLA and UC Berkeley, and all you do is wash other people's laundry. That was the only available job back then, right? For some of my colleagues. And they said, enough is enough. 1955, they flipped the state into an all Republican to all Democrat, led by Senator Inouye and some of those other guys, right? So it's sort of amazing to know that history. And I never knew that. I never read that in textbooks until I hung out with folks in the ethnic studies movements in the 1955 democratic revolutions, and being in African American spaces. I have to say, I've just been really influenced. And today I owe it to Native Hawaiians for making me proud of being Filipino. At one point I didn't want to be Filipino until I saw Native Hawaiians being so proud of who they are. That's not always been the case, as our ancestors will tell us. There was points in which you had to fight for who you are, but I owe all of that, and I couldn't. I never took an ethnic studies class, and yet I'm teaching an ethnic studies class. Funny, yeah? But all of my teachers in the ethnic studies, that's who I hung up around with. The Auntie Terry Kiko'olanis, the Kyle Kajihiros, the Darlene Rodriguez, all these radical folks that saw the integration of social activism, faith, Aina, all and packaged it all in one. And also it helps to have good food in their meetings. That's where I went. So anyway, I want to end with that. I think we have some time for a question and answer. It says mahalo. And if you don't speak Ilocano over here, it's Diyos ti agnina. That's thank you in Ilocano. And then on the bottom says salamat is Tagalog. Okay. So now you know 2 languages at the very least. Diyos ti agnina is Ilocano. Salamat is Tagalog. Okay. Okay.
I always wondered how old you were, Jeff, because you seem so accomplished.
On paper.
I've spoken to you several times, and every time I'm so impressed with your enthusiasm and your energy. So thank you so much for sharing tonight. Are there any questions for Jeff? Lee, did you have a question?
Yeah, I was wondering how you found those youth leaders that you took on those trips. How did you, they weren't from churches and stuff, were they? No.
They were actually. They were from churches. Some of them, we didn't. So for the R2W, we sort of sent folks to just canvass the churches and who might be interested. And then it was sort of the youth leaders that recommended 1 or 2. We couldn't take everybody from one church, but maybe 1 or 2 was recommended. And then, yeah. And that's how it happened.
Really exciting stuff that you did.
Is that bike shop still open?
It is. It's on Singapore Road. It's open. You can go in there anytime that you want. If you want a bike, go ahead and buy from them. It's built, not bought.
Any other questions? Any other comments? I see a lot of comments coming through.
Thank you.
A lot of thank yous, Jeff.
Jeffrey, this is David Popham. I've got just a simple question. A number of our churches are older and no longer host youth at a Sunday service or something like that. So what's just a suggestion, a simple place to start to make these connections and to build these relationships?
That's simple and complicated, David, but I just start, talk to them. What do they want to see? But there's definitely, if in your local church, just talk to them, see what's sort of happening. Not tell them now, because adults have this tendency to tell people what to do, right? Including myself, I do that too, right? But ask them sort of what's happening. But I'm sure that also there's other programs and youths that from other churches that's doing really great things. UCC Filipino has some really great programs that I hear about. They're so well organized, and so I'm very much can learn from them. So join all of that other stuff, but there's no shortage of programs that welcomes young people, or that you can go visit and see how they're attracting young folks. So that's what I often done. I sort of visit other communities to see, wow, what can I learn from this particular space that I can take back in my own context and see if it works or not. Some work, some doesn't, but it won't work if you don't try it. See.
I have one more comment. A lot of us have congregations who use our space Chukis, Marshallese, Pohnpin, all sorts that we pretty much kind of stay apart from. And I think as our kids, become more, doing well and everything, and don't really feel like they, need the church as much, they're longing for ways to be included or have some leadership roles or be invited to synod or whatever. So I think we should really, a lot of those kids could be right on our campus, but we just don't ever get together with them.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that comment. I mean, my partner and my wife saying like, oh, I wish somebody asked me to sit on their committee or on their boards when she was younger, because now she's realizing those skills are so important in her graduate program, just to sort of be invited and be nurtured. And I think that's what Auntie Haunani was talking about, a rotation in leadership. Sometimes there's so much expectation in the leader that it's so hard to meet all of the expectations to be a leader. But if we had the framework of sort of a rotational leadership, it allows people to become more sustainable in terms of if somebody cannot make them, they can always assume, and I appreciate the trips that you folks take your young folks on. I think those are really life-changing. But again, you have to sort of flip the script. Sometimes when we take young people out, they become tourists. And you know how we know like tourists in Hawaii at times, right? I mean, they get so irritating. I bet we're that irritating. We're the irritant when we go out, because some of our tourists not exactly coming here, for critical consciousness, right? And I don't blame them. My mom's a housekeeper at Hilton Hawaiian Village, so I need some of the tourists to employ my mom, right? But what I'm saying is if we can give them a particular framework to going into new communities so that they don't behave like tourists, they behave more like pilgrims, like honoring that space in which they go, and how are they related to that space, right? So when we took people to San Francisco, I said, you're not just gonna be cool and hip in San Francisco. We're gonna go to Angel Island. We're gonna learn about your own roots and your own history. And we're gonna learn what other people are doing in that particular community. So we got to visit the Prevention Institute. We got to visit like other centers that are more grassroots employing their thing. And I would say even for great activist circles, they didn't even what I love about being part of UCC, and I can say now this is for the first time in 35 years, I feel a spiritual home within this church. And I think the openness, but also like if my particular framework is faith, I love God talk. I love faith. I love theology because it allows us to vision beyond the practical and the pragmatic, right? And to me, like young people, I think like gravitate towards that. You look at all of Black Lives Matter movement. You look at the Dakota Pipeline movement. You look at Mauna Kea struggle. Other young people creating education and curriculum without institutional help sometimes. Sometimes the institution put the red tape, right? Like it's so much. So I think Kahu David is working on maybe taking off some of the red tape and making it easier for all of us to access resources, but also to get together. And so I think those are some of the things that I love what the church can do. And I tell you, a lot of my colleagues left the church, right? But they didn't leave their faith. They're looking for a place to worship. That's the one thing that I ask a lot of them. They can be really smart and they can do all of this stuff. And I said, what is it that's missing? And they said, I need a spiritual home. I need to find wholeness in church. And I rejected the theology, but it doesn't mean I rejected Christ. And so I think that particular part is a reach. I think we can start to bring in people when we look outward, and instead of sometimes preserving the pews, maybe the pews ought to look at each other instead of looking at the pastor. I don't know. These are just some ideas, right? Anyway, I should stop talking. But any other sort of comments and questions? Anything resonated with you that will make me want to sleep good tonight in good dreams?
I continue to be impressed with you and your wife, Jeff. Jeff's wife is in law school, right?
Social work school, but she wants to go into law because she's inspired by some of the lawyers at the UCC. They do like really good job. Yeah, she is. She's met some really cool mentors within the UCC. I mean, I can name a handful of you folks already online, but that's what I mean in terms of the mentorship. She only decided to be going to law because she started being mentored by some of the elders here in the church. And so she's inspired to merge social work and law and church. By the way, she was a longtime non-believer until she came into the UCC. I didn't do it. It was the food after service. Can I leave? I just one more request for you folks to think about. I want to share with you my lifelong dream. Is that okay? I'll just take 1 minute. My lifelong dream, maybe the motivation of why I wanted to do this. Let me say, I dream someday that we can grow our own theology in Hawaii, that we can have cohorts of generations to choose from, pastor our churches, to do ministries in our communities, but not an imported theology from the continent, though we welcome everybody. I just think there's so much power to being in Hawaii, to being Hawaiian, to being Filipino, to being Samoan, to being Japanese, Sansei Japanese, right? I just think there's so much power in there that we miss out in cultivating that theology from the Aina that we have. So can you imagine if we have 30-something pastors of MDivs that's coming from Hawaii every year and they come back to serve, and they'll bring their community. But in order for that to happen, it has to start now, not when, like, I used to be a youth worker. I used to be part of the youth. All of a sudden, I wake up 10 years later, I'm no longer part of the youth. That's the tricky part of this work. It costs a lot of money. It costs a lot of time. But I think sustainably, we don't have to have the conversation of where our youth is. If we can start to invest in a new, younger generation. Although I'm not saying we should spend money on old folks, right? Because I'm getting old, I need some money as well too. But to have that particular cohort and come back, because they love Hawaii. I have a lot of friends who left Hawaii and say, I just don't have a job. I want to go into the church, but I can't make more money. And that's not their language. I cannot sustain myself. And so we need to be able to sort of think about how do we honor people who studying, want to come and serve Hawaii. And as you know, like church work, like the thank yous mean more, and that's why we stay. It's not so much about the money, but then we have family members to take care of. So those are other things. But in the end, I hope that you start to think about cultivating that leadership and send one person in your church to seminary. Ask them. I think they will want to go. And then they can go as a cohort, as a community. And then can you imagine that all of the UCC churches will come and go into Honolulu International Airport or on the Big Island or in Maui, and we're welcoming them. And you have droves of MDivs, of future pastors coming down. And they're speaking Samoan, they're speaking Hawaiian, they're speaking Chukis. You're building the kingdom of God, right? And that's what I get really passionate about. But it's a hard work. It's a lot of risks because you're going to lose the young people to the mainland, 30%, all of those things. But who cares? We should just do it, right? We should just do it. So anyway, that was my dream. Hopefully you can kind of think about that and send out some prayers, and maybe we can make something happen. And if you ever need me to come to the church, to your church, I would love to sit down and have a meal and talk story and figure out where we can go. I'm open. I love Hawaii. Every time I travel the world, I come back to Hawaii and says, wow, I am so blessed to be part of this land. And what can I do more? And you folks funded my education as taxpayers going to UH Mānoa. I want to give back. 80% of tuition is taxpayer funded. Right? So we have a responsibility. I have a responsibility to give back and honor and whatever. So please think about it, and I will be quiet now. I talk too much. Thank you.
We thank Jeff again. Yay!
Aloha, everybody.
Mahalo.
Aloha, Jeff.
Aloha to everyone.
Mahalo nui.